Welcome back to the Road to Emmaus journey. Today we're going to be getting into Hebrews chapter 3. Hebrews, which to be honest might be my favorite book in the Bible. In fact, let's read verses 12 and 13 together. It says, "See to it, brothers and sisters, that none of you has a sinful, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God, but encourage one another daily, as long as it's called today, so that none of you may be hardened by sin's deceitfulness." Now, if you read a little earlier in the chapter through verses 7 and 8, you'll pick up on something that the author of Hebrews is doing that's very impactful for us today. In verse 7 and 8, the Bible begins to describe the Israelites when they were in the wilderness after they had left Egypt. And the Bible's using that story as a warning and an encouragement to the church. In fact, when you read the whole book of Hebrews, you begin to realize that the author is describing life in general as a journey through a wilderness. And verse 13 is telling us, in fact, it's instructing us that the only way we're going to make it through the wilderness is through encouragement. Now, that word encouragement in the Greek is where we actually get our English word for counseling. So watch this. The book of Hebrews is warning us that you're never going to make it through life without counseling. You'll never make it through the wilderness without daily counseling. Now, think about that. Think about the Israelites in the wilderness just for a moment. When we think about a wilderness today, what pops kind of into our heads? We think about a forest, right? But that's not the type of wilderness described in the Old Testament. The wilderness in the Bible is a desert. It's an arid place, a place with no normal supply of water. And although you would pass through the wilderness, and you could pass through the wilderness, because there wasn't a lot of water and there was just a few patches of grass, you couldn't settle there or you would die. You could move through it quickly, but you couldn't settle. And not only that, but the wilderness was a place where it seemed like God was distant. It seemed like He wasn't providing for His people, and the Israelites felt abandoned by God. They even complained and murmured that God wasn't with them and that they wanted to go back to Egypt. And the book of Hebrews is talking right now to suffering Christians and saying, don't be like them. Don't be like the Israelites. Don't get to the point where you just give up. So let's dissect this just a little bit more. And it's amazing because the author of Hebrews is making some pretty serious claims. Number one, he's saying that life in this world, spiritually speaking, is a lot like a wilderness, like we're saying. Like literally a desert. Family, a good career, money, possessions, friends, all these things that make life happy and satisfying will never be able to truly fulfill our hearts. The Israelites traveled through a literal desert, and yes, there was some grass for the livestock, and yes, there was some water, but if they stayed there, if they didn't continue to move forward, it would be death. And listen to me, a good family, marriage, possessions, an awesome job, lots of friends will make you happy for a while. It will make life worth living for a short season, but if you try to camp there, and that's all that life is about, in time, you will spiritually die. You will begin to spiritually thirst. Number two, in the wilderness, according to the stories of the Bible, the miracles of God were few and far between. The Israelites wanted God to move and do something every single day, and they always expected God to show up in a certain way every time they met some difficulty. And the truth is, God never moved the way they wanted Him to or expected Him to. And the author of Hebrews is telling us that more often than not, God will not do things the way we want Him to or the way we think He should. In fact, a lot of times it will almost feel like God's asleep or like God has even forgotten about us. See, when you're traveling through a wilderness, it just seems like God isn't around. It gets really hard to believe in God when He's not doing anything, especially when He's not doing the things you're asking Him to do. And Hebrews is telling us that a large portion of life here on earth is going to feel like that. So verse 13 shows us that inevitably every single Christian is going to become hard. You need counseling or you're going to become hard. The author is warning us that we all will become cynical about life and about other people and even about ourselves. We're all going to get bitter at times. We're all going to stop trusting. We're all going to stop hoping. And the only way we could protect ourselves from this is we need to seek out daily counseling. Now, what kind of counseling is the Bible talking about? What are you saying, Pastor Michael? You telling me I need to get a shrink? Because I got some friends who are doing that, and to be honest, they're not any better off. Well, let's look at it for a second. The book of Hebrews is an interesting book because it feels like it's written by a schizophrenic. When you read the book, even just in one chapter, it will sound so encouraging and so tender and so loving. And then just a few verses down, the book begins to become so direct and so stern and so harsh in its tone. When you read it, you don't always know how to respond. In fact, it can even become confusing until you go back and you think about the ministry and the life of Jesus. When you read about Jesus' earthly ministry, Jesus responds to people exactly the same way, like the book of Hebrews. Jesus at one moment could be so compassionate and loving and even crying with a person that's in pain. And the next minute be so direct and rebuke the very person he was comforting. Weird, right? Well, not exactly. Jesus knew what it was to be filled with grace and truth, the Bible tells us. He could cry with you at certain times and then speak some hard words and rebuke you at other times. Jesus walked in the ministry of love and the ministry of truth. And if you are honest, if you're really honest with yourself, you know you cannot survive without both. Sometimes we just need someone to sit down with us, just weep with us, not even say a word. And sometimes we need a punch to the gut, someone who's not going to sugarcoat things. We need both in our lives if we're going to live and we're going to grow. We cannot survive in this world. We can't survive in this wilderness journey without counseling that is equally balanced by truth and love. And the only place we can get that is from Christ. See, the way we encourage each other is we point each other to Jesus. We remind each other of his ministry of love and of truth. And when we start spending time with Jesus every single day, talking to him, worshiping him, reading his love letter to us, the Bible, what it does is it begins to protect our hearts from growing hard, and we find an oasis in the wilderness. Springs Church, it was a blessing being with you today. Check back tomorrow as we get back into Hebrews chapter 4. Until then, God bless.